And so let me begin with a question. I want to follow up on Bill's comment about the measure of agreement here, actually, on family structure playing a role. And I think there's also probably agreement that there are cultural reasons for that and economic reasons for that they both play in. I guess I would tend to myself suggest that there are different effects of family structure on what you might call the underclass or dependency class, and on the working class. I think it seems to me that when you're dealing with really lower socioeconomic levels, that there's a lot of family non-formation precisely because of the economic reasons. That a lot of black women just don't have available a black man who can earn any money, for instance, in order to make a marriage plausible. But when I think of the breakdown of the family in the working class, and especially the high levels of divorce, my understanding at least is that most divorces are filed by women, about 2/3 or more.
Correct.
And second, the general reason for it is nothing to do with finances. It's actually lack of emotional connection. And that's utterly believable, given human, men who are really good at not making emotional
Chris,
connection.
I've never understood why women think that men would make good husbands.
Indeed. So, I certainly wouldn't deny that there's an economic factor. I guess I would tend to, stress more I think the broad cultural factors and new ideas of what, marriage is supposed to do for people, especially, I think a lot of people, especially perhaps women, look to marriage and to men for something that, as Mike suggests, they can't really provide. And that's a much more broad cultural shift in some ways. And I tend to think that that's probably the dominant or the most important reason, even though I think the economics plays something of a role. So, what you think?
It's hard to know. I mean, I'm going to try to be as honest and direct as possible, because if you have, if you have over here a big change, and over here two big changes, trying to figure out the contribution, the relative contribution of each of those changes to the phenomenon to be explained. I mean, it's a classic social science question, but defining the independent variables precisely enough so that you get an answer to that question is going to be very difficult. And so for 25 years, I've just sort of shrugged and said, there's no way of ending the culture versus economics discussion in family structure. So why don't we just agree to name both of those as big parts of the analysis and move on to see what could be done in each of those spheres to make a positive difference? Because one thing I am sure of, based on the research that I trust, and that is that from the standpoint of the well-being of children, there is often not a lot to choose between family non-formation and family dissolution. Especially, and this is increasingly the case, if family dissolution means that the former husband and the father disappears from the family orbit. And the evidence on that point I find compelling to the point of overwhelming, that the amount of time that divorced fathers on average spend with the children, particularly if there's not shared custody, and frequently there's not, is surprisingly small. And labor economists of all people have done a lot of good work in the last 5 years indicating that situation is much more damaging for the character formation of boys than it is of girls. It's not good for girls, but it's much, much worse for boys. And an MIT labor economist by the name of David Autor, who's nobody's idea of a conservative, has done some of the best work on this subject, and it is really quite striking how badly, on average, boys do in either of these circumstances, marital non-formation or marital dissolution. And what I'm most concerned about is the ability of these children to function successfully in society when they grow up. And what can be done to increase the odds that they will be able to do that, accepting arguendo, Michael's cultural pessimism, that is, a lost battle that is not likely to be refought and won.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the problem is that on the one hand, I'm happy to accept the proposition that we will never be able to disentangle the precise share of the economic versus the cultural and so on. And I'm happy to accept the proposition that we should proceed from there to saying, well, what can be done? The problem is that what can be done on half of that equation requires refighting that lost cultural battle. And I guess I'm in part of my mind, I'm willing to concede that it's lost for the time being, but in another part of my mind, the part of my mind that I use to argue with liberals, I'm a little bit frustrated that I am supposed to somehow concede that when I feel like, I mean, I'm happy as a conservative, and I probably am happy to go further than Michael would in terms of sort of making concessions in terms of what specific steps the government can take to literally put more money in the pockets of, and I would say the working class, because I think most of the strategies for putting money in people's pockets should be tied to work. Obviously that doesn't go far enough for a lot of people on the left, but it does go further than a lot of people on the right would want to go. But I feel like when I take those steps, it would be nice to have, in return, liberals take some steps beyond the steps that the liberal upper middle class already takes. Liberal upper middle class, my friends and neighbors and colleagues and so on, take the step of saying, it's good to have kids after you get married, right? And they take the step of saying divorce is probably bad for kids and so on. But those aren't hard steps to take because the liberal upper middle class has already internalized that wisdom in its own life, right? There's the post-sexual revolution stability that the upper middle class and upper class have sort of groped their way to does involve saying, yeah, we're not, mostly we're not going to have kids until we get married, and mostly divorce is bad for kids and disruptive to finances and disruptive to sort of all the good things in upper middle class life in general. But the bargain that the upper middle class has made is that, we'll have this sort of stability, but then we'll also enjoy, it's enjoyable to live in a libertine culture in many ways. You don't have to deny yourself things when you're, in your 20s and single. You don't have to deny yourself things that you might happen to look at on the internet. You don't, there's a certain level of there's a certain level of self-denial that liberalism gets to avoid by saying that, well, we can't relitigate anything to do with sort of sexual mores before and around marriage. And part of me thinks, for the time being, that's right, and the best that cultural conservatives can hope for is to sort of, build up enclaves and communities and so on, and have Catholic colleges in red America that inculcate a different ethos than colleges in other parts of the countries and so on. But part of me objects and says, if you want political conservatives to make concessions on what the government is doing economically, which require accepting higher levels of taxation and actual sacrifices actual sort of pocketbook sacrifices ultimately from the middle class voters who form the bulk of the Republican coalition at this point, then at a cultural level, maybe modern liberalism should be willing to sacrifice a few more of the pleasures that come from the current sexual order. And if you there's a horrible crudeness to the argument that the working class family doesn't work because working class men find it too easy to have sex. But there's also some truth to it. And there's, the sort of the reason that working class women feel, I think, reasonably that they aren't getting what they want to get out of relationships and marriages and so on is itself linked to a premarital climate in which very little is asked of men at all to get the thing that young men, in my experience, tend to want a great deal. And that's, one of the engines, for good or ill, of a large amount of male behavior throughout human history. And so I do think that, regardless of the economic landscape, working class families would be in better shape, and working class boys would be more likely to be raised by fathers if the premarital sexual climate in America, period, had different norms around it. And I don't know exactly how you get to those norms, but to get there, I need to persuade my liberal friends to make a few more concessions.
Can I take you up on that?
Well, yes, but you're, yeah,
I know,
you
I
might
don't-
not be representative. That's
Well, but I'm the only one here.
I know.
Yeah.
You may be close to,
There's,
you may be close to the
We
only
have
one
to
in the
go to war with
Democratic
the
Party.
liberals we have here.
Yes.
Okay,
Right.
so.
Right, you have a conversation with the liberals you have, and not the liberals you want. Yeah.
Well, it's not just that you're not a majority, it's that you are pretty alone, I
Okay,
think.
let me follow up on this, because I'm not quite alone. I'll just tell a little personal story. As a bunch of us were going out the door of the White House and going back to private life in the mid 1990s, we got together and started something called the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. This was at a time when teen pregnancy rates were just at record highs, and nobody thought anything could be done about it. And we weren't sure whether anything could be done about it, but we thought it was worth a try. And it's been one of the most gratifying and successful 20-year time investments I've ever made in my life, or will ever make. And teen pregnancy rates are down 60% from their high. It's really a remarkable social change. I think that there's every reason to try to do something along those lines for the broader issue, Ross, that you're putting on the table. There's every reason to try, but I am even more pessimistic. I think what you're proposing is a harder nut to crack than teen pregnancy. And I say that in part based on the experience of the Bush administration, right? Someone we both know pretty well, probably, Wade Horn at Department of Health and Human Services, was in charge of the marital promotion programs that the Bush administration put into place. And we've all seen the same evaluation of those programs. They didn't move the needle. And so, I'd be, if you're talking about a grand bargain, a grand bargain, I think you might get a lot of takers on my side of the aisle if there were a lot of evidence that we had any bleeping idea at all about how to move forward towards the goal. Now, Charles Murray, has said something very pointed and interesting. That is, it's time for the liberal upper middle classes to preach what they practice. And I think, I think that's a reasonable slogan, right? Why should we believe that something is good for us and our children, but not good or not possible for other people and other people's children? There is no good reason to make that assumption. But I'm not sure how to carry the argument forward from there.
Well, I think part of
Go.
I think part of the problem, and this again speaks to the sort of deep impracticality of what I'm saying, is that what I think would have to change is not something that involves marriage initiatives. It's something that involves a cultural sea change. Like I don't expect marriage promotion projects funded by the Department of Health and Human Services to make a difference anywhere except at the margin of the margin of the margin. I do think that Hollywood has a huge influence on American culture. I think that the tabloid industry, reality television, has huge influences on American culture. It strikes me that there might be a sort of modus vivendi in between the current tabloid culture and the sort of pure fantasies that were spun about celebrities being virtuous in the 1940s. Maybe there isn't. Maybe it's either or. But it just strikes me as someone, I try and consume a fair amount of reality television just to know what, is going on in American life, obviously. And but those shows are produced by people. I mean, that's the place where I think I think the Murray argument is weak in various ways. Like I don't think that newspaper columnists and Brookings fellows and so on are in much of a position to preach to anybody in the American working class, and nor should we be. But I think effectively, people in the culture industries do preach to a wider audience, and their choices. I guess I feel like a lot of sort of the culture industry is run by people who are the equivalent of, the Silicon Valley barons who don't let their kids use iPads until they're 12, right? That, people produce shows and put out products and so on that are not sort of vile and, they're not hardcore pornography, but they are corrosive of any kind of and any kind of reasonable moral order around human sexuality. And so that's where I think that's, I guess, the liberalism more than sort of Clintonian liberals circa 1998. It's that sort of broader cultural liberalism, and I don't expect to win that battle because you're talking about decades-long sea changes that drive things. So.
Mike?
Yeah, no, I was.
And we're back to your pessimism.
Well, but I was going to say, I always puzzled over that part of Charles's book. What would that look like? The 1% are now supposed to sort of stand on street corners and, preach to the poor.
Sackcloth and ashes.
That'll go over really well. Look, just a few words about the other part, and the reason why I'm additionally pessimistic. Even if you just focus on the things where you think that economics has something to do with it and you could move the needle, as we like to say, I'm pessimistic about those two. Because we just don't have the government institutions anymore that can run these things. So I think this is a fairly common, my skepticism in that regard is fairly common, certainly on sort of my side of the political fence, but I think by now among the American people in general. So people then propose preschool programs around the country. When the evidence is we can't even run the schools that we have, and now we want new ones for even littler children, I see the point why people propose this, and I get the impulse or the impetus behind it, and that's all good and fine. I'm not hostile to it, but my skepticism of institutions is now too deep-seated to sort of embrace much of that at all. So count me out of your bargain.
Well, this is where we can gang up on Bill for a minute. Give us your four big inequality fighting interventions that you think conservatives should either consider supporting or should be bulldozed over when we oppose?
Well, first of all, speaking honestly and realistically, given the current configuration of political forces in the country, it's going to be very difficult for any side to bulldoze the other for very long. There are too many equilibrating forces. And so that's part of the deep explanation for why I'm more interested in beachheads of common ground than I am beating each other's heads over the differences. But for example, when productivity goes up, there ought to be something in that for people that are employed by more productive firms. And my reading of the evidence, and I know if Scott Winship were here, he'd give me an argument, but I think I'm right, I really do. My reading of the argument is that for a very long time, as firms became more productive, the gains from productivity were shared to some extent with the people who worked in that firm. That is much less true than it used to be. And so one of my preferred mechanisms would be using the tax code to give businesses incentives to close that gap. Details to come. But I mean, I have been following the hourly wage statistics since the end of the Great Recession. They haven't budged, corrected for inflation. There has been growth in the economy, not vigorous, but slowly and steadily. And there have been productivity gains, not huge, but you pile through the miracle of compound interest, one small change on top of another on an annual basis, and you have productivity gains of 10 or 12%, and wage stagnation. There's something wrong with this picture. And it's wrong in a way that goes to the basic thesis that I was urging in my opening remarks, and that is the broad promise is of broadly shared prosperity. And one of the classic post-World War mechanisms for doing that was a substantial measure of alignment between productivity gains and wage gains. And that alignment has, for all practical purposes, collapsed.
Is there a difference between wage gains and compensation gains?
Well, I'm using wages as short for compensation, but in fact, if you use the compensation metric, the story is very much the same.
But isn't the amount of compensation that goes to healthcare substantially greater now than was the case before because of rising healthcare costs?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it hasn't changed substantially in the past 20 years as a share of total remuneration to workers. And one reason for that is that businesses have gotten very good at holding down their subsidies to workers in the face of rising healthcare costs by offering plans that are cheaper because of higher copays and higher deductibles, which is so that when you actually look at the share of workers' incomes going to healthcare, that's been going up substantially because of what they have to pay before the health insurance kicks in to pay the rest. So businesses have figured out how to manage that. There was a period 30 years ago when this explosion was starting, when they hadn't figured it out, and that's when there was a jump in compensation, non-wage compensation as a share of the total compensation. At least that's my reading of the empirical story.
What about the fact that it's maybe bimodal, and that is you have some businesses that have just gotten out of healthcare or don't have more part-time workers and don't give healthcare, whereas especially larger businesses, my impression is that what they give to healthcare, even with the deductibles and copays and so forth, is substantially greater. I just think of the universities that I've been a part of, where I think there's been a very substantial increase in the cost of the universities for the healthcare.
There's no question about that, but I'd caution against reading what's true of universities back into the totality of the private sector, because universities, until very recently, have not been subjected to the same kinds of competitive pressures that most of the firms in the private sector have. And that is a powerful disincentive to make promises that you think will come at the expense of your market share, especially when your competitors are increasingly from outside the country.
Yeah.
My sense is, and I'm no economist, and let alone a labor economist, so I just read this stuff because it interests me. And so some things I find plausible, and then I tend to remember them, especially if it's as recent as today's Wall Street Journal. And they have this description, maybe it was yesterday, I can't remember. The story is very different with respect to sharing gains from productivity and profitability from industry to industry. And this is sort of Peter Orszag, also no one's idea of a crackpot conservative, right? So there's some industries, high tech, healthcare, finance, with very substantial wage gains over time, and other industries that are sort of employment heavy, but have declined in profitability, so there wasn't an awful lot to share, and so the wages have been relatively stagnant. Again, that's a sort of second-hand.
I'm prepared to accept that, but then you have to reckon with the aggregate, okay?
No, I get that.
And in the aggregate, the share of the total national product going to wages is at a post-World War II low.
I understand that.
And the share of profits is at a post-World War II high. Now, that's if you believe the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I do know that they've been using a constant methodology through that period. Now, it doesn't prove that the numbers are right, but why would the relationships change?
So how, I know it's details to be determined, but just how would this tax incentive work? You would get a deduction based on how?
Well, it can be either a carrot or a stick, and one way of structuring it, and the two of you are going to jump out of your chairs in dismay when you hear about this, but that's okay.
It's going to be an individual mandate.
No, it's, but what it's,
Eat broccoli.
it's going to be more like an enforceable collective norm, and that is that, through very simple reporting mechanisms, firms can disclose wages and total hours, and then if the misalignment, then you can calculate productivity based on the numerator and the denominator, and if there's a huge misalignment between productivity gains and wage gains, you either close it or you pay some of the difference into a wage fund, which would then be used by the government as a wage supplement. So one way, sort of like the old Fram oil filter ads, you can pay me now, you can pay me later. One way or another, whether it's through an internal corrective mechanism or an external corrective mechanism, there would be money. There would be money to begin to narrow the gap between what you earn and what you produce.
And you prefer this to a sort of more generic wage subsidy because you actually want to target the companies that are not living up to their. I'm just curious. I'm just curious.
Well, in fact,
I mean, this. What is the advantage of this over just a, whether it's just a sort of straightforward wage subsidy?
Well,
I guess.
Look, from the standpoint of simple administrability, there may be something, there may be something to be said for the generic wage subsidy. But I'm I'm leery of creating programs that are like the rain that falls on the just and the unjust alike. In other words, if they're good actors and bad actors,
Right.
why should the good actors be punished when they haven't done anything wrong? There's nothing in their behavior to correct. Why should the law apply to them?
What tells you, Bill, that the current baseline is the correct one? So let's say, right, the ratio between profits and wages or whatever you want to use as a yardstick for any given industry, is A in industry 1, and it's A plus 2 in the next industry.
I'm not.
Why would you want to start with that baseline?
You wouldn't, and that's not my argument. In other words, I threw in, and let me explain why. I threw in the point about aggregate wages, aggregate profits as a share of national income, just to point out that the sums were not equal in these two Orzag categories. That in the aggregate, there's been a tendency in one direction. I'm making a much simpler point, and that is that when productivity improves in an industry, that is the basis on which firms are able to afford wage increases. That's and if you don't have productivity increases, you can't have wage increases and sustain your business. If you do, you can. And in the past 20 years, increasingly, firms have discovered that they can pocket the productivity gains without sharing them with workers to a significant extent. And in my view, it's circumstances in the international economy that didn't exist in previous generations that enables that kind of behavior. But that doesn't mean we simply have to sit back and accept it. And I think it's, among other things, it's one of the mechanisms that slows economic growth because it slows domestic purchasing power.
I feel I don't want to lead us too far into the weeds on this.
But you don't agree.
No, I'm just not. I mean,
I don't agree either.
generally, yeah. I'm generally. There's a complexity to it that I'm skeptical about.
Yes.
I'm skeptical. I mean, there are a few issues. I mean, we're doing better on overall employment now, obviously, than we were when a lot of these debates started up, around the passage of Obamacare and so on. But I guess I also, generally, I'm wary of policies that might, and maybe I'm misjudging this, but might discourage hiring over the long run, where the sort of marginal cost of employing an extra worker goes up in an era of increasing automation. And I'm even though we have come a bit closer to full employment recently, if you ignore discouraged workers and people dropping out of the workforce and so on, I still sense that over the next 25 to 50 years, that the challenge of, I mean, we see it in Europe, as you said in your remarks, that sort of chronic unemployment can be a big problem in developed economies right now. So yeah, so I'm skeptical. It's similar to the minimum wage debate, where I do assume that minimum wages discourage hiring on the margins. I don't want to discourage hiring. I also worry about the government figuring out what is the ideal wage for a given industry or corporation to pay, and so I would rather do the simpler thing if we're doing something about inequality, and have wage subsidies that would fall on the, if McDonald's is paying its workers what it can afford, but Hardee's isn't, the subsidy would fall on the just McDonald's and the unjust Hardee's alike, and I guess I prefer that.
Yeah.
But
I could go with that.
But I'm totally with you. I mean, and I'm curious what you think about the universal pre-K debate, right? Because this is where, right now, where the Democratic Party is going does seem to be towards a focus that I'm sort of sympathetic towards in the abstract, towards sort of a focus on family-related issues and family policy. But with a combined assumption that what you need are more regulations on businesses around employment and parenthood, and a big new system of pre-K, of sort of publicly funded pre-Ks, that in the two best sort of large-scale experiments we have in Quebec and in Tennessee delivered seemingly very disappointing academic results. And that seems to be where we're going to be fighting, since we should probably talk about real-world politics for a minute. That's where we're going to be fighting in 2016. It's going to be, that seems like the Hillary Clinton agenda. I mean, that seems like the most popular part of the Hillary Clinton agenda domestically, is sort of family policy. And I wonder both what you think about its effectiveness overall, and also how it relates to, is paid family leave an inequality fighting measure? Is it not?
Gosh, you put a lot of questions on the table.
Sorry.
No,
You can ask me about the Marco Rubio's $6 trillion budget hole. I mean, it's too easy to put Republicans on the spot. That's the problem.
First of all, I'm about to make my first rhetorical cheap shot of the evening, I believe, but I think I'm entitled to one. I would say that both Obamacare and Obama-era regulations are regularly denounced as job killers. Well, if they're job killers, they've done a very poor job of being job killers, as I think we would both agree, because employment gains have been not only steady but more than respectable. It's total compensation that is going nowhere, not hiring, and
labor force participation.
Labor force participation
is lousy, which is why the unemployment numbers look good.
It is lousy, but oh gosh, talk about getting into the weeds. If one of the problems that we have is an aging population, and this has been predicted, by the way. So about 1/3, if you look at labor force participation, the decline, about 1/3 of it is attributable to economic conditions that are now rectifying themselves. About 1/3 of it is attributable to the consequences of an aging population, and then the remaining third is unexplained. But there was
Thanks, Obama.
Yeah, and well, that's okay. But let's get to pre-K. We're even. Let's get to pre-K. I think that what's important to understand in both the pre-K and the family leave debate is not so much the programs as the motivation behind the programs. In other words, there are real problems lurking behind perhaps flawed responses to those problems. In the case of pre-K, what we know is that children from less advantaged backgrounds are a year behind their peers the day that they present themselves for kindergarten. Okay, if you look at their school readiness, if you look at their vocabulary, if you look at the mastery of things like letters and numbers, they're a year behind, and they never catch up. The net effect of 12 years of education is to double that 1 year gap, so they're 2 years behind by the time they reach 12th grade, if they reach 12th grade. So part of the motivation of these programs, some of which test a lot better than others, and many are not effective at all, is to try to answer the question, absent a revolution in the structure of the family, footnote, our previous discussion, do you simply shrug and say, okay, we're going to take the consequences of this kind of family dysfunction, we're going to take it for the educational attainment and life prospects of these kids who through no fault of their own are behind from a very early age, or are you going to try to compensate for it in some way? That's practically and realistically the challenge that we face. And I grant you that the evidence on pre-K programs is mixed at best. I grant you that. I guess I would then knock the ball back across the net. If you agree with my depiction of the problem, that huge cohorts of kids are starting out far behind their more fortunate peers, do we do nothing or do we do something? And and it's a perfectly coherent response to say there's nothing we can do. I don't think that's what you want to say. And so then the question is, what is it that you want to say?
There's not a whole lot we can do, is my
I knew you would
answer.
say that.
I also have some doubts as to whether whether it's simply a concern for the kids that actually is leading toward universal pre-K. It seems to me that it's a significant part of it is a more feminist agenda.
I really do.
Well, this
I mean-
is,
Go on, Ross.
I mean, I think that's setting aside sort of feminism qua ideology. I think the best case for universal pre-K is about the disadvantage to working class parents, not to the disadvantage to their kids. I guess I am comfortable saying that if the best evidence we have, so if one, we already have 12 years of public schooling on which we have something like doubled spending over 30 years without improving outcomes, and I know that's happening against a backdrop of confounding social factors, but at the very least, we don't have a lot of evidence that more spending on those 12 years has produced big results. Then, and when, again, so far, the biggest experiments have shown, in Quebec especially, I think, actually negative results. So you're actually you're not only not helping the kids, you're potentially, it actually ends up being worse than whatever environment they had absent the program in terms of their long-term benefits. I am pretty comfortable saying I'd rather do nothing than spend a lot of money on a program that doesn't seem to work. Now, I think the rebuttal is to say, well, in a society organized like ours, you are disadvantaging working class parents, mothers and fathers, right now if they don't have any child care for their kids at that age, because you want them to go to work, and even sort of Republican conservative economic visions tend to assume high levels of female workforce participation, and certainly Republican-led welfare reforms prod single mothers into the workforce in ways that I think are defensible, but do cut against other conservative goals in certain ways. So given all that, and especially if you're prodding working class mothers into the workforce, there is a sort of justice or an injustice that childcare is so unaffordable, and there is this sort of structural disadvantage. But that's just a case for universal daycare. We shouldn't call it universal pre-K. We should say we're going to subsidize daycare. And then I would further say, in my reform conservative sort of split the difference, I won't say split the baby in the context of those debates, that I say I want, I'd rather have a combination of larger earned income tax credit and child tax credit, and let parents who want to stay home pocket the money and stay home, and let parents who want to spend it on private daycare spend it on that, than I would to build, again, a new system in an era when I see no evidence we're good at building systems.
Do you have questions you want to ask each other based from earlier parts of the discussion tonight? Other avenues you want to pursue in terms of questions about the causes of inequality, the magnitude, responses?
If I can ask Bill something, and it's an honest question. It will come off, as a tirade and a polemic, but that's just me being me. I don't mean it.
On the contrary, I enjoy your tirades.
No, it's a serious question, and
Yeah.
it's actually prompted by the pre-K education example. What strikes me as remarkable about sort of the current political climate is just the sheer degree of incompetence and stupidity on the part of the government that American voters just put up with, okay? And at the same time, no, I mean, people are sniggering in the audience, but what do you mean you can't build a website? I mean, does anybody remember that? Right,
If they built it, it would have been hacked immediately by the Chinese. So that was better off not being built.
And look, at the same time, there's this sort of striking pursuit of what I view as sort of policy baubles and political luxury goods. And what I have in mind in particular is energy and climate policy. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is a while ago, the Washington Post had this big sort of map of the United States by county. And then they had different colors for when did those counties reach the highest point of the median wage. And there was this big sort of streak through America, and they had the courtesy of explaining for the counties that had the highest median income within the past 5 years. And there's an asterisk next to the thing, to the map that says, this is explained by the fracking revolution or the energy. It's all energy production. There's this huge corridor through America, right? If you sort of put prosperity on top of oil wells, you get a one-on-one match. It's a policy that, it's something that, it's probably the only really good thing that happened to the American economy over the past 8 years. And it's no thanks to the federal government. It hasn't taken off at all. I mean, if you drive up through Pennsylvania, through Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, and then into New York, it looks like that famous map of sort of, Korea at night, right? South Korea is sort of, lights blazing. In North Korea, there's not a single light. That's what the boundary between Pennsylvania and New York now looks like, because Pennsylvania has allowed energy production. And Scranton is actually a livable place, believe it or not, now. And Binghamton is, lots of things come to mind, I won't utter them. And that's a policy choice, right? That is something we can actually influence. And these are real jobs, and they're not $40,000 jobs, they're $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 jobs. And they're real, they're not on government, they're not green jobs, they're the opposite of green jobs. And why is it that we don't learn from that, but instead sort of it's one, renewable energy, affordable energy, no energy at all the energy you want from the sun, next year. Right? It's a lot that's hanging over the economy. These are very simple things. They're not remotely on the scale of the American family structure, which nobody can do an awful lot about. They're very pragmatic things to do or not to do if we were actually serious about these things. And we don't seem to be serious about them. It's this constant pursuit of, if the country is really in trouble, we should stop pursuing all these luxury goods. And this is not a sort of, there are actually charts, a curve, right? If you look at the demand for climate protection, it looks like the demand curve for BMWs. That's what this is, a political luxury good. And nobody apparently is out there saying, we cannot afford this. It's too serious, we need those jobs, we need at least some confidence, to remove some of the uncertainty that hangs over the economy. That strikes me as a very simple thing. And I could probably in 5 more minutes come up with 6 more things that are simple, doable. Those are political decisions, not deep structural problems.
Run off a list.
Beg your pardon?
Run off your list of 5 or 6 things, or
Oh, look, I mentioned the net neutrality thing. That's sort of a very straightforward one. I think, the Keystone Pipeline, I think that was a no-brainer. There are lots of these things, and we don't do them.
I mean, part of the debate, if I can not fully take Bill's side, but lend him some assistance, is that there is a debate over what constitutes a luxury good around climate policy, right? And if, depending on how you assess the risks around climate change, then, I mean, I think Keystone is sort of, the jobs it created are not as large as the jobs that it would have created, are not as large as the jobs that fracking created, but the environmental costs are not what the environmentalists said they were. So it's sort of...
It's a non-issue.
Right. Well, but it is, I'm
It's
taking your side. I'm taking your side. So on, sorry. But on climate policy, I mean, there's a distinction. I mean, what's your view of the, we subsidize green energy, however effectively or not, in part because we're trying to take out an insurance policy against long-term global dislocations and disasters, right? I mean, that's the theory. It's not just sort of, it's like, the Nissan Leaf is a luxury good, but the policy is conceived of as an insurance policy.
Look, the question in that debate, it seems to me, is what to do under conditions of enormous uncertainty. And the answer you get when you say that is, it's not uncertain, you're not allowed to say that, you will go to jail if you say that one more time because you're a climate denier, right? And if it were just an insurance policy, the way you describe it, we do much more modest things.
Well, I mean, what
They're
is...
proposing really draconian things, remaking the entire American electricity grid. For what?
Well, okay, there's a distinction, though, between what's being proposed and what we're actually doing. If you look at what we're actually doing anyway, Bill, sorry, I'm not...
No, you're doing
I
it
can
great.
only go so far on the, climate alarmist or...
You went far too far.
We'll just leave it there.
how much agreement is there on rent seeking? Michael raised that point strongly in his initial presentation that a lot of the problem of inequality is precisely inequality created by government because of the opportunities it provides for rent seeking. And he even mentioned the possibility, is there a possibility of actually cross-ideological agreement on some of this, kind of removing or diminishing some of the rent seeking that goes on by government? How much agreement or disagreement is there on the panel on that, do you think?
I think it's tough because there's a lot of, if you're going big, if you want to get rid of big areas of rent seeking, they tend to be fastened on to big areas of redistribution. I mean, there's a reason that, the healthcare industry, for instance, there's a lot of rent seeking in the healthcare industry, but that's also the place where the federal government spends large and, with Obamacare, increasing sums of money that are redistributive and do have, I think, from a liberal perspective, are desirable in part precisely because they have a mitigating effect on inequality. And so disentangling those two things is tricky. And here's where I think a liberal would also reasonably say, well, look, we would like to have a healthcare system with less rent seeking. It's called single payer, but you conservatives won't let us have that. So we end up with these public-private partnerships that have, that inherently involve rent seeking. And I think that can be a fair rejoinder. I think there are rejoinders to the rejoinder, but I don't know. What do you?
Well, I think it would be interesting, just to test the possibility of agreement, to put a concrete policy area on the table, our tax system. right? The tax system, in my view, which I think is not idiosyncratic, is riddled with provisions that reflect rent sinking by all sorts of organized interests, some of which are on my side of the aisle, some of which are on your side of the aisle. And I don't think there's any way that we can do tax reform halfway. Right? If it's going to work politically, then we would have to put everything on the table. And including a lot of things that are regarded as sacred cows on my side of the aisle and on your side of the aisle. But I wonder whether we'd agree or get close to agreement on a most preferred general shape of a reformed tax system. I suspect we could make a lot of progress going down that road.
But don't you think part of the issue is, I mean, there's sort of two layers, right? Layer one is, in terms of there's rent-seeking and interest groups and loopholes and distortions and so on, and that's places where you have interest groups on both sides who love the current system,
Right.
and high-minded people like the three of us on both sides who hate the current system. And if you were just saying, well, tax reform means going through the code and striking things out, I think, yeah, we'd get a long way. We'd probably have, as far as I can tell, there'd be intra-conservative disagreements about what to do about child tax credits, and there'd be liberal versus conservative disagreements about where to cap, the charitable deduction and so on. I mean, there would be disagreements even among the high-minded wonks, but we could all get rid of, the home mortgage deduction, the sort of the biggest, and then there'd be fights about healthcare, of course, but we could get a long way. But then the sticking point for tax reform, it seems like, is just a disagreement about what level of revenue you want to end up raising, right? So I think if you to take the man who I think is the most likely Republican nominee, right, Marco Rubio, I think probably if you put Marco Rubio and Mike Lee from Utah and had them, they've already designed a tax reform, they would, presume that they hone it and refine it and so on. I imagine that in terms of sort of what struck out from the current code, you would like a lot of what Rubio Lee would do. But then Rubio Lee makes what even I, as a conservative, consider insane assumptions about the level of revenue the government needs for the foreseeable future, and that's been the biggest sticking point between the high-minded sides. And there, I'm happy to concede that Republicans are a big part of the problem, not because I think Republicans are wrong to want to hold spending and hold tax revenue to close to its historical share of GDP, but because they want to believe or tell themselves they believe or something that you can go even lower, without specifying the cuts that will pay for it. So but that, I think, more than the question of what you strike out, is where the big division. I mean, you saw this in the Obama-Boehner negotiations way back when, right? That you could sort of get close to agreement on the tax reform, but then the White House wanted revenue at level X, and that to at least a big part of the Republican caucus was defined as a tax increase, so that was unacceptable, so you couldn't have a deal, even though both sides could have agreed that we're capping this deduction here and closing that loophole there. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'll answer in one sentence. I think the only conceivable basis for comprehensive tax reform is revenue neutrality. And that was the frame for the successful '86 effort.
Right.
Whether it was actually revenue neutral is a different question, but that was the negotiating frame, and that's the only way that doesn't tilt the discussion unacceptably in one direction or the other.
Well, but then that's partially an indictment of the Obama White House. Because,
in the same way that you aren't here to defend
No, I'm not.
everything that, I've made a long list in my mind of, of areas where you haven't, and my reading of the Obama-Boehner negotiations is probably a lot like yours. That is, there were errors on both sides, but the president's last-minute demand for more revenue was bound to blow things up. I don't think it's just Boehner's fault not being able to control his caucus.
There's the cynical Milton Friedman position, which is that the optimal tax code from the rent seeker's perspective is a very simple one with relatively flat rates, because that's the point when you sort of can send the lobbyists back to Washington and clamor for the exemptions. Milton Friedman actually thought that this explained the 1986 reforms, so it did the opposite of what had been intended to do. But this,
I surrender.
Well, that's truly the counsel of despair.
This was not meant as an endorsement of our present of our present tax system. What it is to suggest ever so gently is that the art is not to do the deal once, but to stabilize it over time, right? And I just don't know how one would do that. So that's an added layer of complexity, how to sort of insulate that bargain. There are political bargains that are relatively stable over time, right? Because everyone understands how they were supposed to work, and the coalitions hold tolerably well. The tax code may not be among those kinds of things. I just don't know. What this did bring to mind is, I'm a little struck by this. We haven't talked about it at all. I think to a large extent, what we've done over the past decades has been debt financed, right? And for example, median family pre-tax, they would look much worse and people would be much harder up had it not been for a sequence of tax cuts over the Bush years, for example, in the run-up to the financial crisis.
Which is why the Obama White House did not want to actually repeal the full Bush tax cuts.
Yeah. So, and I think where I sit, this looks, as the word goes, unsustainable. At some point, this will become very, very difficult. And you can have a long and difficult discussion about sort of intergenerational equity and all the rest of it. But what does seem to me fair to say is that for all the polarization in the country, we have a rock-solid consensus that is supported by 95% of the American people, which is, let's have a really big transfer state and not pay for it. And it's right, and that has, that may seem at one remove from inequality, but really, if you're thinking about sort of what are we distributing here, that is what we're distributing, a lot of debt.
Yeah.
The first time I ever met Bill, I think, I had just co-written an article about domestic policy, urging Republicans to embrace, among other things, the larger child tax credit. This was, a long time ago, and this is still what I'm doing, I guess. And this was the Bush era when Republicans were in favor of, Republicans had decided deficits didn't matter, and Democrats were pointing out that they did. And I distinctly remember you talking about something like the Galston pincers or something, the problem of converging retirement of the baby boomers, and I forget what the other pincer was, but the point was basically, those are nice ideas, young conservative would-be wonk, but how the hell are you going to pay for them? And at the time, I think I had grown up in the 1990s, and so I had come into political awareness with Ross Perot and deficit panics, and then that had all seemed to evaporate, and so I was sort of insouciant about deficits. And then, like most conservatives, I decided that actually deficits were in fact really worrisome, and that decision coincided coincidentally with Barack Obama entering the White House. And now I'm sort of in between again. I mean, I agree about the sort of, I agree enough to look at something like Marco Rubio's tax plan and say, as much as I like the Rubio domestic policy agenda overall, this tax plan is insane and can't be implemented. And I agree enough to sort of generally support a focus on the deficit in negotiations over the budget and so on. But I also wonder, I feel like the experience of the last 3 years has made me a little more sympathetic towards, I think it's Brad DeLong's Medici America hypothesis, basically, which is that we do live in a world where the US is likely to remain the safest bet for people to park their money for a very long time to come, much as the Medici banks in the Middle Ages were such a safe place to park their money that people would actually pay the bank to hang on to it. You would have, negative interest rates and so on. And I don't believe that enough to become an insouciant deficits don't matter 25-year-old again. But I am less worried about deficits than I was 3 or 4 years ago. And I think that the fact that the markets reacted to all our crazy budget negotiations and the skyrocketing deficits in the first 2 years of the Obama administration and the brinksmanship over the debt ceiling and so on with this long yawn and this sense that actually the US was still a pretty safe bet means that maybe we are actually not a pretty safe bet in any absolute way, but where else are people going to go?
Permanent winners in an ugly dog context.
Well, yeah, yes, it's, the kingdom of the blind, we could go on all night.
Well, let's take another 5-minute break, and there's some refreshments outside. You can use the bathrooms, and then we'll come back, and then I want to let our audience be part of the discussion tonight as well.